So when I ask students what they believe to be the biggest limitation of the study or the biggest challenge that Jody Miller faced in doing this research, they seem to express the most concern about whether or not these girls are telling the truth about life in the gang, about basic questions that she's asking them, and about whether or not they actually are, legitimate gang members and not lying to, say, get the money that she ended up paying participants after she had trouble finding participants out in Columbus. I think it's really important here to note that gang scholars have long debated how to deal with this because, believe it or not, there are young people out there who will claim they're affiliated with a gang, claim that they're in a gang, but then not be able to answer specific questions about it at all. And so they're often considered to be wannabes or peripheral members, associates versus members. Different scholars have come up with different terms to refer to these different individuals. And they've come up with also some pretty restrictive ways of determining gang status. Like, okay, we don't consider you a real gang member unless you know the signs, the language, symbols, and you're up to date on those. You're not, making reference to symbols that you saw in a movie that actually in real life, according to, people who work with gang members and law enforcement, those gang and former members, those symbols aren't symbols of that gang anymore. And if, you can tell us some information about the structure of the gang, a bit about how it's organized, and things that can be independently verified by law enforcement in that area. Without that information, correct answers there, so to speak, some gang scholars aren't going to consider you a real gang member. But gang scholars also have some looser definitions that can include not exactly a wannabe, but somebody who associates with gang members. Why would we do that? Well, many gangs have people who hang out with them. People in gangs don't only associate with other people who are in gangs. They know other people. They have friends outside the gang. And there are some people who they hang out with gang members. But they aren't members themselves. Many who associate end up becoming gang members. And, basically anybody who becomes a gang member goes through a period of associating and hanging out before they join. So we can still learn something from those individuals. So when Jody Miller asked some of those tougher and more specific questions, she didn't go through the whole rigmarole, but she asked some pointed questions, and there are really only a couple of cases, right, where a girl could not answer those questions. So really the vast majority, pretty much everybody in her sample who ended up staying in the sample, they talked about their gang in a way that really legitimately suggested that they were a real member. Now, the question of whether they're telling the truth about everything else she asked them about, this is simply an issue with any kind of research on a sensitive topic in particular. So what did she do to try to facilitate trust with these girls so that they'd feel comfortable being honest? So this section of the chapter mostly speaks for itself. What she did basically was make sure that she took time to build rapport, right? Make sure that she took time to establish trust, and had some techniques for doing that. Another thing that she did was tend to and make sure she was protecting confidentiality. So, in terms of building rapport, she started with real neutral questions in her survey, and she went on over the course of the interview into the more, intrusive questions. You want to lead with a super intrusive question because people are going to say, whoa, I don't even know you yet. So you start with the neutral questions first. It's generally a good idea. And you want to be neutral, right? Don't have a look on your face when you hear a particular answer that shocks you. You can't be shocked. You can't express, concern. You can't give advice. You are neutral, right? So that you don't suggest to them that certain answers are inappropriate. That's not your role as a researcher, right? Confidentiality. Show yourself protecting it. I think this is a really important aspect of building rapport, really. I mean, all of these elements all go together, essentially. She would pause the recorder, right? Because she was audio taping this stuff. She would pause the recorder when someone was like walking outside the hall of the room that they were in, just to say, all right, hold on. Let's wait till that person passes, to make sure that, or try to make sure that nobody outside could overhear what the girl was having to say, right? If a girl mentioned somebody in particular by name, right, she would kind of pause the recorder and say, are you sure? Are you comfortable with like having just said that name? Do you want me to rewind it and restart? So really trying to show the girls that she has their best interest in mind and that she doesn't want them to say something that could be on the record. Letting them be in charge, right, of the story that gets told. Generally, in terms of establishing trust, it follows from sort of what I just said, right? Let them be the expert. Let them tell the story. You're there, a researcher, as the learner. You don't have the knowledge. Those participants have the knowledge. You have to sort of situate yourself like that and not demonstrate that you have power or authority over the research situation or over that particular participant. You don't. That person sort of has the power, right, to say what they want to be able to say, to not say what they're uncomfortable saying, to not answer certain questions if they're uncomfortable, all of that. Use language that is appropriate. Don't start using all kinds of gang terms that you don't really know about, right? That can come off as fake, like a poser, right? And the last thing is you have to get past this issue of social distance. Really, by building rapport, establishing trust, protecting confidentiality, those should help minimize the impact of social distance. The sort of concept of social distance, in another one of my classes we talk about this using the term cultural clash, right? It just means Jody Miller was not exactly the same, right, as her research participants. She was different in race, she was different in ethnicity, she was different in age, she was different in background. She's in graduate school, she's highly educated compared to them. And that can affect the research relationship. For some participants, they're not really going to be able to connect with you if you're that much different than them. Other times, being quite different can actually be advantageous, because then you're more of an outsider and you might be able to more easily position yourself as like the ignorant learner, right? The student, and they're the teacher. All of the issues with social distance played out in a really interesting way in this study. You have to kind of read into the footnotes of the chapter that are at the end of the book, or the end notes rather, to be able to know how that all played out. So she had two other people who did some of the interviews with the girls, and one was an African American woman and one was an African American man. And so a lot of people will hypothesize, if your research participants are girls, the interviewer should be a woman. If your research participants are of one race, you should have the interviewer be of the same race because it's easier to connect. Well, that's actually not always the case. And this study is an example of how that isn't always the case, right? She had two other people doing interviews with the girls. One was a black or African American man. The other was a black or African American woman. And many would hypothesize, the other woman would get closest to the girls and get the best information. Well, that is not what happened. When the three of them sat down and, got together with all of their data and started looking at what the girls had told them and talked about their experiences doing these interviews, it seemed like the girls were actually most forthcoming and sort of had the best rapport with the man. And why that is surprising in certain ways is because they seem to be most forthcoming with him, particularly when talking about abuse victimization. And that kind of runs counter to what we might think, because we know that girls are more likely to be abused, particularly sexually, by men versus, or males, versus females. And that often leads to a situation where we think that the girls won't be very forthcoming with that man, because they don't have good relationships with men. On the other hand, you can think, well, they're young, fairly young girls, and he's an older, but not that old, fairly young man, and kind of take it from there, right? They may have really appreciated the fact that there was a male figure who was really interested in their life, right? And who wasn't interested in a romantic way. So maybe that facilitated the rapport that they had with him. Versus there is, some research that suggests, and Jody talks about this a little bit, that the closer in similarities of the interviewer to the interviewees, that can kind of backfire on you. And this may be because the interviewee is more likely to feel judged by somebody who is most like them versus someone who is more of an outsider. So that all speaks to just how important it is to take the time to educate yourself and train others that you're working with on how to build rapport, on how to establish trust, and how to do other things such as protect confidentiality to be able to foster good relationships with the people that you are wanting to learn from. And that basically wraps up Chapter 2.